Welcome to Sprout Labs Getting Started with the 70-20-10 Model for Trainers webinar recording. I'm Robin Pettit, the director and founder of Sprout Labs. I'm also the person who does a lot of our events and produces a lot of our content and resources and templates for other people to use as well. Our webinars are a really interactive experience, and what we do is we do these recordings afterwards and do a little bit of a summary of some of the interactions that happen during them. If you actually come along to the webinar, they're a lot more interactive than what I'm actually talking about today. But we find if we record them, people actually interact a whole lot less. So quickly to do an introduction to Sprout Labs, we help organizations design learning ecosystems that accelerate expertise. We work across sort of 4 different service areas, and we quite often work with start to work with organizations around strategy, then we help them design and develop programs, help them support and put in place the right technologies. We have 2 key technologies we work with, Tatara LMS and our own next-gen piece of learning software called Glasshouse. A lot of the solutions we work with have lots of moving parts. They're based on a 70-20-10 learning model, and we then help people implement those and coach them through the process of making those transformations in their organizations to working with learning ecosystems. Today, what I'm going to be talking about is a little bit on how to use a 70-20-10 model to achieve real behaviour change in the workplace, touching really quickly on social learning and integrating that into programs, and a little bit on 70-20-10 and design the 70 model. It's really an introductory workshop and a session, because essentially covering a lot of different areas. It's a getting started. So in actual fact, some of this materials is actually covered in more depth in some of our other webinars and in some of our webinar recordings. Now, because it's a getting started session, I don't normally actually spend a lot of time talking about what the 70-20-10 model is. To give you a bit of an introduction, it's the idea that 70% of learning occurs in informal situations through experience, quite often through watching others or taking on hard tasks. Then 20% happens from working with others, quite often from your direct line manager and your peers, and then 10% happens from formal courses and reading. It's interesting, the research first came about in the 90s from a fairly small cohort that was around leadership training, and this probably really fits with a sort of research around leadership training and the challenges around as well. And it's a very hard skill, so it actually involves lots of experiential based learning. I actually think of it as being the natural way to learn. To re-quote J. Cross, it's a combination, it's an integrated way of learning. It accepts that learning's based on experience, not knowledge. It's based in developing skills and expertise, working with others, reflecting, and not just taking in knowledge. And one of the important things to remember with it is it's a recipe, not a formula. Not quite sure who actually came up with this quote, whether or not it's Charles Jennings or Andrew Jenkins from the 70-20-10 forum when he was working there. But it's a really nice way of giving a sense that it's not actually like a number that you have to actually abide by. There's probably not a lot of, and there isn't a lot of research behind it to say that it's actually the right way to learn. There is actually a lot of research behind saying, yes, experiential learning is really important, that people constructing and building their own knowledge is important, learning from others is important, and there's also a lot of research to show that a lot of formal learning actually ends up as scrap learning, and we don't actually take it on in our workplaces. The other thing combined with this move towards the 70-20-10 as a really elegant way to explain how learning's really happening is a move in L&D to capability development. And I think this move is more than just a name change. It's a real shift in the way people are starting to think about capability development and the people and skills and process and infrastructure. My sort of working definition of capability development is it's around the people, processes, and infrastructure that an organization needs for the future. It's not just about people. Competency is about the skills, knowledge, attitudes, or mindsets that quite often people need now. Capability takes in these sort of processes and structures as well. It's sort of the 70-20-10 model and capability development have a nice fit together because they're both ways of working. They were working with what I call beyond courses. This notion that you're not just producing events, you're working at a more strategic level in a way that we call working with ecosystems to build layered approaches that are combinations of interventions and designs and things that happen over a longer period of time to affect real behavioural change. I'm not going to drill a lot into what an ecosystem is today. I'm just going to touch on quickly this idea of there's multiple bits of elements that come together. One important part of this notion is that in actual fact, a 70-20-10 model has more moving parts. It's more complicated than just organising a face-to-face session or producing an e-learning module. It's more complex and quite often actually more expensive, even if it's possibly more efficient and effective in the long run, but it's actually possibly more expensive in the short term. Now, one of the things I've started to notice is that consultants that are walking into an organisation thinking in a different way around business problems are quite often better than this holistic way of working than what trainers are. So an organisation that's walking in doing work around improving safety systems and safety culture and training as part of that actually possibly uses training as a last resort. And this sort of is a rethinking around performance as well. It's actually training as a last resort and performance improvement, performance support, and other things are actually the first steps and first point of call. One of the barriers to this way of working, which I just hinted at before, is that the time and cost. It is actually a more expensive way of working quite often, and it's just more complicated as well because there's more parts to it. Now, at this stage in the webinar, this was when I did a little bit of a thought experiment that was really interesting because it was a little bit polarizing. The thought experiment was what would happen if trainers couldn't charge for their time. Now, there was one cohort of people who put up onto the whiteboard some quite strong feelings about the fact that what would that would result in terrible training. No one would care about it. You'd have bad facilitators. No one would actually have any buy-in because trainers were not being respected for their time. And then there was another group of people who started to make the link that, well, if they couldn't pay for their time, they'd have to actually charge for the value. They'd be charging for the outcomes that they were achieving. So there'll be a lot more different conversations at the beginning and the end, and there'll be a lot more thinking about outcomes and measurements of outcomes. Some of the other sort of comments people made were that there would be more focus on upskilling others to do the work of trainers as well and of communicating. And there would be more sort of gap filling around capability development as well. One of the real keys to this moving to a different way of working is different conversations at the start. I run a podcast called Learning Way Working, and constantly during the podcast we come back to this idea that really powerful questions at the start really define different types of conversations and solutions. It's interesting that it keeps on coming back up as a theme. It's not always easy when people come to you and sit there and say we want a training solution or we want an e-learning module to then sit there and say let's pause for a moment and think about things in a different way. Paul Matthews has written a really interesting book around capability development where he sort of says one way to approach that is to sit there and say, yes, and can we just have this little bit of a discussion around 5 or 6 core things to do with performance before we move forward with the training. He uses this sort of fishbone diagram that also has a relationship and sometimes used for root cause analysis work in lean thinking as well. And essentially, it's about running a workshop that explores not just skills or knowledge and mindsets, but also exploring and having conversations to map around infrastructure and processes to see how they are affecting the end performance of people as well, and whether or not the measurements that are actually happening as well are getting in the way or helping or hindering as well. It's a nice way of being able to restructure the conversations, present it on a whiteboard, have a conversation that's in a structured way that's moving beyond the conversations around training. You might have noticed I'm talking about the 70-20-10 model, not the 70-20-10 framework. There was a really important moment in a webinar where I actually got tongue-tied around these two things, and I realised that in actual fact, one of the beautiful things about the 70-20-10 model is it's just so flexible. It can be so many different things. It can be used for continuous learning. It can be used for blended learning, which is really what we're talking about today. And that's its beauty, but it doesn't have the depth of what a framework possibly is. So what we've done at Sprout Labs, and it's available for download on our website, is developed what's called a Learning by Working framework. Now, in the Learning by Working framework, we've separated out 3 different design patterns around L&D, and it comes from some work from a Finnish academic who essentially sorted what the functions of L&D into 3 things are: generating new knowledge, which is a totally new area for L&D to be operating in, sharing new knowledge, and then also being in the spot of bringing new knowledge into an organisation. The second 2 are the more sort of traditional activities for L&D. And then these sort of design patterns have a sort of natural flow about where they start in the 70-20-10 model. So sharing knowledge. So by sharing knowledge, it might be something like an onboarding program, which is essentially about doing a whole, this is the way we do it, this is our policies, this is our procedures, this is our practice. And that can sometimes, if there's good practice in place in the workplace, can actually happen a lot in the 70. It can be absorbed by what people are doing. I think this is why part of the 70-20-10 model, we sort of start with the notion that the 70 is quite often about seeing what other people are doing. We actually naturally mirror what's happening in that 70. And that also means that things like an onboarding program can possibly be thought of as something that starts in the 70 and is supported by social learning and learning through others and formal learning as well. Possibly sometimes the formal learning is about the things that people don't get exposed to often in their actual workplace. Then creating new knowledge is really around that sort of continuous learning, continuous improvement, and innovation. This is a really new area for L&D to be working in. And it's where possibly, if you can build a culture of 70-20-10 and continuous learning, you're actually at the spot in an organisation where you can have the most gain. It's also the most challenging spot to start with as well. Last but not least is what's almost the most traditional function of L&D. To bring new knowledge into an organisation, to sit there and go, actually we need to be better at change management, or we need to be better at risk management. Our people need new skills and knowledge. Let's run a course in the formal and then bring it back into the organisation. Also one of the things that's most challenging because it's actually real deep behavioural change. And this is why, in actual fact, the 70-20-10 model is a really powerful way to be able to help change behaviour, because you can sit there and quite often say, yes, we'll do a workshop, but we need to wrap around some knowledge transfers and activation of the learning in the workplace as well. It's not just about running the workshop. One of the things that I'm sure we've all seen is this curve around how quickly we forget knowledge after a training event. And I think it's one of the things that every time I see it and think about it, I go, wow, I've experienced this myself as a learner, how quickly I forget, how quickly and how hard it is to sometimes actually take new practices back into a workplace situation. So what we're starting to talk about here is essentially the practice of what's sometimes called learning transfer or knowledge transfer, or in actual fact, some of the leaders in this area at a place called Fort Hill, they've started to talk about activating working in the workplace. I came across this really nice formula for this sort of learning transfer approach. It was in an interview with Sean Sheldrick from Growability that I was doing as a podcast. And it's from Zana, Falkman and Shewan. So it's this notion that implementation of learning is actually a combination of motivation, accountability, visibility, and follow-up. I think it's just a really elegant way of being able to say that it involves multiple different things. And sometimes learning transfer just focuses on visibility and follow-up, but you also have to address the motivations of the learner and the organisation, and then also make sure people are accountable as well. So then at this stage we did an exercise that was about addressing motivations when designing learning. Some of the themes that came back up was actually really thinking about the needs of the people involved in the programs, but also thinking about the needs of the organisation as well, and making sure those things were aligned, and really engaging the business, the managers and senior managers in what's involved with the change as well. Really thinking about the what's in it for me, and that a number of people talked about that, and that was that sense of just really thinking through your audience is so important, and who your learners are. It's really the first step in any sort of design thinking approach as well. One of the other really nice things is identifying them. One of the other really nice ideas that came out of the group was identifying the obstacles to motivation. What's hard about the new learning, and what's going to be hard about applying that, and then directly addressing that in the design. That was one of those moments of insight when I went, actually, that's a really interesting one to actually think about it in terms of actually what's going to demotivate people and make sure they don't actually take it up, and then directly addressing that in a nice way. Then on to quickly about designing for accountability. This really means putting evaluation first, thinking about the measurements, thinking about the impact, and really talking about the impact from day one. Quite often doesn't come naturally to L&D people and trainers to sit there and in early parts of conversations, to have conversations around metrics and to really figure that through. There was recently in a workshop around an induction, I sort of said, have you thought about how you're going to evaluate it? And people naturally talked about surveys, feedback from managers, and I went, well, yes, but what's actually the end outcome? And as we fleshed it through, it was actually the fact that if they could be in a spot where people stayed in the organisation longer because the induction program was better, that would be a really good way of measuring impact. And it was actually also something that was quite controllable by L&D and the HR area. I think one of the most powerful words for me around evaluation is actually talking about impact. And I talked quickly before about Fort Hill, and in their 6D systems, they had this really nice notion of an impact conversation. And impact conversations happen between a manager and an employee in their team before an event and then after an event, and asking questions like, well, what's the business outcome? How are we going to see a change in your performance from the manager? And then also, I think really importantly, from that people manager, to be thinking about how that person having a different set of skills and knowledge, especially if it's just a single person, is going to actually affect the team, and then what might else have to be changed in the team as well. Now, if I was a training provider doing face-to-face programs, I would be strongly thinking about mandating this particular process as a really simple way of being able to work with people and increase transfer. So when people, I actually did at the beginning of the webinar, I asked, what's your motivation? So in actual fact, instead of starting with a session with what's your motivation for being here, what's your agreed impact with your manager that this session is going to have, is a really different type of conversation to start a training session with. At Sprout Labs, one day, one of our consultants coined this idea that 20 is in the middle of the 70-20-10 model, because it's people that hold together the training experience and the learning experience. That really it's actually quite often people's line managers that are actually the key to their learning experience. And research has shown that a number of times. And I think it's a really nice way of thinking about the reason that 20 is in the middle is because it's the glue that holds it together. We also talk about the changing role of managers to become learning leaders. And this is easier sometimes than said than done. Most people that have a team have their own workload to do as well, and it's a challenging role to be in a spot, and it's not always something that comes easily. So I think one of those things that trainers can do, and anyone organising a formal learning experience they can do, is to help us to support managers to become learning leaders, and consciously designing their role in the programs as well. 3 things that we've seen that have worked really well is actually making sure that the managers have coaching skills. So making it sort of almost mandatory or a core skill that before someone takes on a trainee that they actually have a set of coaching skills and they have a set of coaching competencies. It's quite common for people to run communities of practices for learners, but also running communities of practices for the managers that are involved, so that they have a forum to be able to talk about challenges and possibilities and improvements to programs. Probably the most important thing with this is also bundling up what we call workplace learning guides, or sometimes I call them workplace learning playbooks. And essentially, these are given both to managers as well as the learners and participants, and they provide suggestions for activities, things like shadowing, mentoring, natural things that are happening at 70, quite often with other people. And they also provide coaching questions and coaching prompts. By actually making sure that both managers and the participants have access to these, this means if a manager's not doing this sort of follow-on activity, it means that the participant that might be really motivated can pick it up as a possibility as well, and then help to reinforce that. At this stage, we did a bit of a barrier and enables exercise to engaging managers. At this stage, we did an interactive exercise around barriers and enablers for expanding managers and roles in training. The barrier that I think most people put up was training, as well as skills and knowledge. Some of the enablers were the fact that it can improve people's performance by having better skills and knowledge, and being better able to help their team function as well. It was funny, I actually talked about it during the webinar, and it was one session in a smaller group. So someone took the mic at this stage. They actually then talked about what they'd done in a small organisation to help managers. They'd actually literally, L&D had walked around and sat there and went, so you don't have enough time to be able to help your team and coach. What can you delegate? And what can you give to people as a learning experience that's actually part of your role? And what they all of a sudden found was the managers, by working this sort of closely and proactively with them, they were able to free up their time and headspace to be able to then work with people to coach them rather than do the actual work. It was a really nice sort of way of being able to get really hands-on, provide a high level of value, and really address the barrier directly around time. Now, on to the last 2 things about visibility and follow-up, which is really about using the 70-20-10 in a blended learning situation to activate learning. At Sprout Labs, we've sort of developed 2 different ways of doing these sort of activation stages of the projects. One is supporting what I call supporting the transfer of learning, and this is really, there's a couple of learning maps around this that I'll explain in a moment. This is where you might still have a big, chunky learning experience. It might be a face-to-face event, a virtual classroom, or a e-learning module. And then added to that is maybe some setup beforehand, and then some follow-up activities as well, including activity in the workplace. Those sort of follow-up activities can be things like action plans, reminders, and then also workplace assessments. A great way of making sure things are followed up and actually done. Now, these are some, on the right-hand side, things like parallel practice, doing a newbie doing the same task as an expert and comparing it, or shadowing, or a newbie going out and interviewing experts, reviewing, maybe the new person reviewing an experienced person's work, or which is actually the sort of reverse to most reviewing processes. Mirroring, so actually walking around with someone, watching what they are doing. Mentoring and reverse mentoring as well can have lots of possibilities as well, which sort of comes across onto the exchange thing of actually going into different parts of organisations and seeing how different parts organise and work. There is actually also some really powerful digital learning tools to be able to do these sorts of follow-up activities. The 70/20 tool from Fortial Company is a really powerful tool where essentially a learner sets a goal and then puts evidence towards that goal, and then a line manager verificates that they've actually reached that goal. And Noxify has some spaced learning activities possibilities as well. And Sprout Labs Glasshouse tool can also do some of this sort of follow-up activity, sending out emails, and in the near future sending out push mobile notifications as well after a learning event, or splitting the learning event into multiple things. There was also a realization from me that some of these things that we use in learning management systems to remind people about compliance training can also be set up to remind people about the learning experiences they're meant to be applying and how to activate learning in their workplace as well. They don't just have to be used in a way where they're reminding people. Now, the other pattern is what I call spaced learning. And this means taking that large chunk of learning and turning it into smaller micro bits that happens over a longer period of time. So literally your brain has longer to process it. They're reconnecting with it constantly. Sometimes it's repeating over time as well. It gives a chance for real behavioural change, and some of those sort of follow-up activities and workplace activities can be linked into that as well. And some of these learning experiences can be things like podcasts or mobile apps. Virtual classrooms work particularly well, or group coaching. And another really nice one that I found has worked extremely well is learning logs or learning journals, to be able to reflect and articulate what they're doing. Humans are social. All learning is social to some extent. And there's a huge desire in L&D to really be able to harness, especially social media and digital technologies, a little bit more. This is not always particularly easy because of what I call the hierarchy of presence. As soon as you introduce something that's got a fairly high presence factor, like face-to-face activity or virtual classroom, that starts to dominate over things like discussions and text-based things. That if you add a discussion after a virtual classroom or a face-to-face session, you'll find that people just won't engage with it because in actual fact they've been through a higher fidelity experience. What you're better off doing is starting lower on your hierarchy of presence. So you start with a discussion, warm people up, then move into something that's a higher fidelity thing, like a face-to-face classroom. You might then have some hope that people actually engage in the discussions afterwards. But just tacking something that's a low fidelity thing on the end of a face-to-face event or a virtual classroom is not going to work. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about face-to-face learning, and I've heard many people talk about it, is that people really value the ability to be able to learn from others and share. A slight experiment for a moment is, in actual fact, if a face-to-face training sessions were reframed as community of practice sessions, well, they could be quite different. To actually sit there and say, instead of these being about knowledge and skills being transferred from a facilitator, is they about sharing knowledge and participants presenting and participants being part of it and really in a community of practice frame, how does that really change the dynamics of what's happening? I've already talked quickly about that sort of notion of changing and moving to online discussion first. And then the other idea, which is like the community of practice idea, is building working out loud circles. We cover this more in one of our other webinars on using social media and social learning. Essentially, it's the notion from a guy called John Stepper, that you bring together a group of people who share what they're doing for the value of others. And it just becomes a way of making work visible. Now, as you probably might have gathered if you were actually part of the session, or you've noticed that Sprout Labs runs virtual classroom sessions and webinars every month, I'm a huge fan of virtual classroom sessions. They're very simple for a face-to-face facilitator to pick up, very similar to working face-to-face, especially if you keep the groups small, 15 people or less. And that can be really powerful. And then if you've got so that's 3 or 4 people, that can also be a great way of doing group coaching. Coaching is one of those really powerful value adds, but it's also one of those really expensive things as well. So actually getting a group of people together and coaching them and having that peer learning as well, without anyone having to travel, but because it's on virtual classrooms, can be a powerful way of saving costs and increasing value as well. I'm going to really quickly talk about designing the 70 and to really remind people there's actually really two timeless ways of learning. There are actually 70-20-10 learning models. We quite often forget them when we're thinking about training now and designing programs. That's project-based learning and apprenticeships. Just to touch on apprenticeships quickly, in Australia we've developed a spot where vocational education and the trades have really taken on the word apprenticeship training. What I find really fascinating is also doctors are trained in an apprenticeship style way, especially at the postgraduate level. They're actually working as doctors, closely supervised, mentored, watched and supported through that process. The thing also with project-based learning is you move from a spot where people might be planning something to actually doing it. And my really nice reframe is a program that might be about change leadership. You could get people to write a change leadership plan, or you could actually get people to do a change leadership project. By getting them to actually do a change leadership program, they're working totally in the 70. They're actually doing something that's having a real effect on the organisation, possibly transforming them. And then at the same time, the trainer is put in a really different spot. They can really scaffold and support the process. A few people asked what I meant by scaffold. What I meant by that is really be at a spot where they're helping the participants through the project in a way where they're preempting problems that they might happen, and then they're asking questions and helping them guide them through a process that might be new to them, but because the trainer's seen it in the past, they can help guide them through that. So it's not just a whole go off and do the project and come back with a result. It's actually helping people through and being a coach for that as well. This also means that the discussions around outcomes and assessments are different. Both project-based learning and apprenticeships normally have an outcome that's visible that can then be assessed and measured as well. And that helps to really shift the conversations about assessment and measurement and evaluation. That brings me to the end of the session. Now, I spend a few hours every week focused on talking to people that have been to our webinars. If you're interested in having a chat about improving your learning and capability development programs, my contact information is below, and I'm sure you've got email messages in your inbox that you can reply to from me as well. Now, next webinar will probably very likely be on helping employees become better at being self-guided learners as well. Thank you everyone for listening and watching this, and I hope you found it useful.